I'm delighted to return to ECHIC after 4 years. I was at the Dublin conference. I think it was the first one, wasn't it? Yes. And I'm very honoured to have been asked to give the Susan Manning Memorial Lecture. Her contribution to comparative and general literature was immense, and I'd like to think that at least some of this presentation is in the spirit of her own research and activities. And I'm going to divide my... I seem to have slightly more time than I thought, so I may go a bit more slowly, but I'll try and keep up in time. About the first half will be about the project that I'm running at the moment, for which I will leave a few posters. It's called Cultural Literacy in Europe, and we actually have a conference coming up in about 2 weeks' time, so if you can come, that would be really lovely. And this is part of the material that I'll be referring to. Okay. Picture a researcher in an international academic forum, perhaps an interdisciplinary research committee or assessment panel, who is asked over coffee or during the opening tour de table to describe her research field. If, like me, she's from the UK, she would give little real information by saying, I'm in a school of modern languages, or an English department. It might make more sense to describe the field in which she got her undergraduate and research degrees as literary studies. But if the next question is, and what are you working on now, as it usually is, the answer might be anything from trauma museums to TV vampires, or even from buried bones to the psychology of skin. And the last one is the one I'm going to come back to later. So the project I'm going to present today was formed to chart the activities of a large group of scholars in the humanities in Europe and beyond. These scholars all began their academic life in literary studies, but have now taken literary questions into areas well beyond the philological study of literary texts. Doesn't mean they don't do any literary texts, they do still look at them, but they're looking in other ways, or they're also looking at other material. So what I would argue is that they're thus entering the field of strategic developments in humanities across and beyond Europe, and of course across and beyond their own discipline, very much the field of this conference. The Cultural Literacy in Europe project aims to make this activity more visible and to explore ways of taking it further. Yeah. In October 2007, which is a long time ago I guess, it had come to the notice of the ESF Standing Committee for the Humanities that there was a problem with literature. What had been observed is that relatively few literary applications seemed to be coming into any of their funding schemes, and among those that did, an even smaller proportion were successful. Rather than decide this meant that little research of any value was going on in the literary field, the committee proposed to create a working group on literary studies. That was very typical of their way of operating, which was good. And this small group first met in St. Gallen in Switzerland. It consisted of 4 standing committee members who were all literary scholars from the Czech Republic, Hungary, Switzerland and the UK. That was me. After initial discussions, the working group reported to the standing committee plenary meeting a day later that it had taken on a threefold project, and that's on this slide, but it's also in your handout as number 1. To analyse the status quo of the literary field of the humanities and its problems, to find a working definition of literary studies, and third, to look into possibilities of developing a strategy to support literary studies in the context of ESF. And the fourth one comes up a little later. First of all, then, what was the problem? The group felt that it was a combination of 2 things. That literary researchers are not much used to networking. We are, if you like, the archetypal lone scholars, reading being, nowadays at least, an intrinsically solo activity, though this is one of the things, of course, that we've been looking into. And secondly, that we're poor at lobbying because we don't have a clear enough sense of ourselves as a field. And I think that's probably still true, which is one of the things that this upcoming conference is going to try and resolve. As the issues became defined in the first strategic workshop, which we held in London a year later, a key 4th issue emerged, that's on the screen. How can we take credit for the social benefits we actually do produce, and how can we develop the field's potential for social added value? And it's very much the things that Anna Marta was just saying, that in a sense, we're not meant to be doing those things, benefiting policymakers directly. But on the other hand, in order to be visible, we have to be visible in certain ways, and so we need to try and think about those things. From the beginning, the group decided on 2 main working definitions. The first was to rename our field as literary and cultural studies. And actually I put this term to somebody who said, that's been around for ages. And in a way it has been around for ages, but we wanted to try and define it more focusedly. And particularly to take cultural studies more directly into the heart of humanities research, rather than, as it originally was conceived in Birmingham in the 60s, as a branch of social science, really looking at it with literature and as a single entity. And the second thing was to present 4 key concepts, which really developed over some years, that characterise both the kind of material that LCS scholars work on and the ways in which they work on it. And crucial to all this is the fact that the work is still that of readers. Our job is still, we feel, to criticise, analyse and synthesise as readers. So here are the 4 concepts on successive, and they are textuality, fictionality, rhetoricity and historicity. I'll read it out because it probably makes it slightly easier, but it's on the screen and also on the handout. So textuality. A text is a weave of meanings. The concept of textuality, what Roland Barthes describes as a galaxy of signifiers, or Clifford Geertz identifies as the thickness, the intricate thickness of the structures that constitute cultures, represents the complexity of all cultural objects and activities. Whether it's an aesthetic construction or a social process, any cultural object can be understood as an artifact. Textuality may or may not presume a maker. The focus is on the formal shape of the thing. LCS techniques that describe, explain and contextualise such structures are valuable tools for understanding and analysing any social entity, from a law to a bodily gesture, and in between. And fictionality. This is probably my favourite because I'm terribly interested in the fiction, non-fiction borderline. In cultural meaning, there is no fixed ground of materiality, yet the referentiality of many artefacts opposes a difference between the real and unreal that is best described by the term fictionality. As its Latin root suggests, a fiction is a thing fashioned. Like textuality, it may well assume a maker, but the identification of fictionality does not necessarily focus on authorship. Like other virtual forms, fictionality may be rule-bound in the sense that it presupposes rules of artifice, but it's not bounded by natural laws. A fiction is not a lie, but its truth claims are not testable. This goes back a long way. To study the fictionality of any object is to study how kinds of truth effect are artfully achieved. Rhetoricity. Assuming language or similar structures to have probable purpose and undoubted effects is rhetoricity. The concept is derived from the art of persuasion through speech, rhetoric, as developed and practiced in Greek and Roman antiquity, but it may be extended to any formal or informal techniques to persuade or manipulate. I mean, I'm telling you things you know, obviously, but we just tried to gather them together as arguments. Metaphors and other figures of speech pervade every level of discourse, and they're never innocent. Why, for example, do we still speak of hard and soft sciences? I was at a committee in Paris where they tend to say les sciences dites dures, les sciences dites molles. And, you know, I'm happy to be among the molles, but, you know, obviously these are very much tendentious ideas. All human artifacts and practices have extension in time, whether or not they have extension in space. Their freighter past is essential to their meaning. While the age of the grand narratives is over, the historicity of things relates to their formation as little narratives, the quality of being a tale told and heard. Historicity has 2 faces. It relates both to the synchronous historical context of a socio-cultural phenomenon and to its position in the diachronic processes of change of which it is a part. The study of all these aspects of historicity can make a direct contribution to the processes of cultural problem solving. So these are our sort of declarations that appear in this document, the Science Policy Briefing. The group decided to open discussion initially by running a strategic workshop for a small number of interested researchers, focusing on those 4 questions of definition and relevance. And it was held at the Institute of Germanic and Romance Studies in London in October 2008, and attended by 20 invited delegates, a balance of senior and early career academics from 14 different countries within and beyond Europe. And the other workshops, which I'll mention a bit more, much more briefly, on the 4 areas that we had, it's all 4s, I'm afraid, sorry about that. The other areas we identified were run on similar lines. They were by invitation and they were small numbers of people, but with the broadest possible spread. And very briefly, I'm going to summarise the conclusions we came to at that first meeting. Very condensed, but there are longer versions elsewhere that I can pass you on to. So what is cultural literacy? Cultural literacy is a way of looking at social and cultural issues, especially issues of change and mobility, and this emerged as we were looking at our material through the lens of literary thinking. It's a way of finding and making sense by looking at the textuality, fictionality, rhetoricity, and historicity of things. And we use things deliberately broadly. It's part of the general movement of interdisciplinarity within humanities and between humanities and other disciplines, but it is a distinctive activity within that larger movement. To offer another example, I was present at a debate a few years ago in London on the questions of implementing new publication methods, which is a discussion that runs and runs. And one speaker said, the problem is that we humanities researchers think in words, and they, policymakers and the funders, think in figures. And I think what we might want to respond to that is that, yes, of course, but we also need figures to think, we need figures too. And of course they also think in words. And the way forward probably is to think together about the rhetoricity of those words and the possible fictionality of those figures. So the next section of my presentation, which is kind of 1B, I'm going to look at the ways in which we developed 4 key areas of activity within the LCS field. And there could well be more. I think what we hoped to do was to sort of summarise 4 ways in which things are going forward and activity is the most rife. But more things may emerge in the upcoming conference or indeed in any input that colleagues might have. And we were looking how in each of them they were bringing together sort of the literary to the non-literary and crossing disciplinary boundaries. And again, we had people who had in fact emerged from literary studies and people who had not, but were interested in that way of looking. And at the end of this presentation, I'll give some examples of my own research, which I hope somewhat typifies this attitude. So the first thing that happened was we met in Dublin, good old Dublin, and that's James Joyce, obviously, in 2009. And the project then took shape as a strategic activity, a synergy, jointly funded and organised by ESF and COST, the humanities sections of both of those organisations. And with a steering committee of 8 academics from 7 European countries, we organised a series of workshops in for these 4 key areas. The first one was in London, and it was on cultural memory, remembering and forgetting. And I'm going to quote a bit of what I've given you in the handout, the sort of very summarised summary. What is perceived as history varies according to the way memory is shaped through different techniques of remembering, whether it is passed on orally or written down, what elements are deemed important and what are left out, and how facts are interpreted in their relationship to each other. The relevance of LCS is implied by the fact that both individually and collectively, remembering and forgetting are only made possible by the use of cultural tools. Perhaps the most widely used of such cultural tools is the creation and dissemination of narratives. And I should add that actually the term narrative is quite interesting because in a way it hovers over everything that we've been doing, but didn't get in to be one of the key terms because I guess we felt perhaps that it had already been used a lot, but it's there in everything, I think. LCS-informed memory studies can be seen as particularly useful in dealing with situations where conflicting strategies of remembering and forgetting create cultural boundaries and exclusion, and thus social and political friction. For example, in the area of ethnic or religious identification, very much still with us. Such situations are ever more frequent in Europe, but societies and institutions often lack an awareness of their historical roots and consequently an essential sense of cultural perspective, which is what LCS can hopefully add. And that was on cultural migration. And we've since expanded the term somewhat to migration and translation. Translation is both metaphorically and literally about languages. So I'll just quote a little here. Cultural translation, a term used frequently in LCS, describes processes of spatial mobility and functions as a paradigm in which to situate journeys, migrations, dislocations and re-territorialization across languages, geographies, identities or social landscapes. In this way, LCS researchers also re-establishes the importance of agency, demonstrating how in the process of dialogic exchange, new voices can emerge, new spaces of cultural production and consumption can be created, and new audiences can be shaped. There's quite a lot of work in that area on exactly how publication publication works in different ways for migration writing. So there was actually interest in writing specifically, a more direct literary one there. But a curiosity as to why people who write as migrants are always expected to write autobiographically. There are other things that can be done that also express translation and movement. So the third one, which was in Istanbul in June 2010, was called Electronic Textuality. I wanted to call it texting, but I thought that the joke might not be very comprehensible in any language, but English, so I didn't. And I'll quote from that one. LCS research enables interdisciplinary perspectives on the transformations of reading and writing, including social science and empirical research, to explore how different media, textual modalities and forms of access affect the content and interpretation of textual material. There was a particular interest in reading here, or what's going on with reading. And one step that was proposed is to focus the education policies of the ERA, both on generally improving people's understanding of the linguistic and textual characteristics of this new flow of knowledge, and on inculcating ways of detecting and analysing its rhetorical and fictional characteristics. I'll move on to the body, which is my sort of particular area. And we held that one in South Ghana in the same year, August 2010. For more than a century, LCS research has actively participated in debates about the body. European research into sexuality and psychology from the 1890s to the 1930s recognised its debts to literary forebears. The term biopolitics was coined by Michel Foucault to describe the growing connection between the human body and its cultural context. And in 1996, Paul Rabino defined the concept of biosociality as the idea that relations between humanity and its environment are mutual and reciprocal. And some of the papers in that they were incredibly wide. They were from things, one of them was on, and that appears in the book that we published, on the way people are the way people are looking to trace their genetic ancestry on the internet and what the effects of that are. From that to the skin, which is my particular area, animal studies, gender and the senses and so on. Okay. So there have been two textual outcomes so far. One of them is this science policy briefing, which can be found online, and the other is a published collection. I brought one copy with me, which is co-edited by myself and Daniela Koleva at Sofia University. And then I'll just briefly tell you what the recommendations of the SPB are, and then I'll go on to Princess Diana, which finally. Okay. But among the four recommendations of the SPB, the first is to run biennial conferences. We're a bit desperate to know how we're going to continue into the future, because of course we need funding as well as everything else. But the conference that's happening from the 16th to the 18th of April, here's the poster again, is deliberately bringing together research in those four areas that I described. And we did a big call for papers and got masses of very interesting and varied things. And policymaker discussions, and I'm going to be listening very closely to the discussions here, because there'll be quite a lot of material that I think will help to feed into the discussions that we have in our conference. And we want to set up a Cultural Literacy in Europe forum, which will be called CLE, or CLEF, depending on your language, and to move forward to continue to develop the project. So the project has been going for a while, but we still think it's got a lot of future in it. Okay, I'm going to move on to some little bits and pieces from my own research. And my last book was on the skin and the sense of touch. It was called Consensuality. And it was partly on a French psychoanalyst called Didier Ancieux, who I will actually only quote once in this presentation, but... Oh, sorry, that was the last one of that section. It touched on various cultural figures and cultural moments and things. And so I'm going to talk now about two... how am I doing?
15.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Two entities, I don't quite know how to describe them. One of them is Princess Diana, the other is the Phantom Limb. And they both have to do with mourning, loss and mourning, how something survives its loss. The whole Princess Diana phenomenon was, of course, very interesting, particularly at the moment of her death. And I was quite struck by it. I didn't actually go to look at the flowers outside Kensington Palace, but I did watched quite intensively on television and collected together the newspapers and magazines of that week after she died, and just started looking rather fascinatedly at the metaphors, and that's really where I start from here. And what I'm looking at is a coincidence of the ways, two ways in which the skin marks the boundary of the female body. I've got two chapters, one is on gide, so I've got the male body and the female body in relation to skin as a boundary. And in both cases I'm looking at the movement of something we might call femininity, how it courses in and out. And two ways for Diana in which it courses in and out are bulimia and radiance. I'm going to start with bulimia. Actually, here are some pictures of her not looking like the sort of Diana she later became. And the only one of these probably that's familiar is the one of her with the two children in the nursery where you can see through her skirt, which was famously one of the initial exposing images of Diana. In her interview that she gave to Martin Bashir of the BBC, Panorama programme, in November 1995, this again was a famous turning point because she said stuff about the royal family that was generally kept secret. She talked about bulimia and she said, this is quote 11 on your handout, you fill your stomach up you fill your stomach up 4 or 5 times a day, some do it more, and it gives you a feeling of comfort. It's like having a pair of arms around you. Well, I thought how curious that image is, because it's an image of being held from inside. And she then immediately added, but it's temporary. And of course it must be, because what's going on here is an interesting circularity. It's a point of balance, achieved momentarily and regularly with bulimia. The rhythm of anorexia is a gradual, inch-by-inch continuum towards an ideal endpoint of emptiness, ultimately death, which I think characterises Gide's desire, but that's another story. Another example would be Kafka's Hungerkünstler, the hunger artist. Each stage being a slightly increased ratio of refusing self to matter barred entry. But it's but bulimia, and that's what makes it a more easily kept secret, a structure of visibility that can remain strictly invisible, is not a continuum but a circuit. The circle it describes has 4 points, 2 states and 2 actions. The excessive ingestion of binging leads to fullness, negatively the bloated stomach, positively the embracing arms. And this in turn leads to the excessive expulsion of vomiting, and its temporary resting point is an emptiness which, unlike the emptiness of anorexia, is a version of stasis equal and opposite to the moment of comfort, in that apparently it brings an ecstatic pleasure. To borrow Diana's own words again, quote 12, I remember the first time I made myself sick. I was so thrilled because I thought this was the release of tension. It's very much a hydraulic image, this whole thing. To cite Didier Ancieux, psychoanalyst of the skin, if I've got quotes in foreign languages, I'm going to read them in those languages, but I've got an English translation there for you. La peau, c'est le sac qui contient et retient à l'intérieur le bon et le plein. The bulimic skin demonstrates its dual function by holding in and keeping out by turns, inviting sensation and protecting against it. It's very much Ancieux's way of talking about the skin. This is the basis of the circuit of bulimia, a circle around, into and out of the surface point of the skin. And now radiance. Radiance, I'd like to argue, works in a very similar way. It's extraordinary, or perhaps it isn't extraordinary, I'm not sure, how frequently and fascinatingly commentators use the term radiant, along with a plethora of cognate images to describe the Diana effect. People used to say, you'd be in a room and she would come in and you'd know she was there behind you. I mean, there's an awful lot of magic, obviously, in traditional ways of talking about royalty, which I'll be talking about a little more in a moment. Now, strictly radiance ought to mean a system of light or heat emerging from the interior. Thus we speak of the secret radiance of pregnant women, with the eyes shining as the windows of the soul, or a radiator, etc. But more exactly, I want to suggest, it's a circular system in which what comes out has first been put in. I mean, famously she would say that she felt emptied after a day of seeing poor, unhappy people, and she'd come home and eat something. But to those who gazed at her, she was very gazeable upon. Rilke describes this exactly in the second Duino Elegy when he's talking about angels, and he says they're mirrors, die entströmte eigene Schönheit wieder schöpfen zurück in das eigene Antlitz. They draw their own, it's a circular stream forth drawback. So with radiance like Bolivia, the circuit presupposes a breachable surface that lets the inner out and takes the outer in, but it also depends on an ideal state of the closed, gleaming face. And all those quotations are in there, and actually I'll probably just leave you to read them, and these are all from those newspaper accounts the week after she died. All that light, in, out of, around and through this woman's body. In the early days, everyone noted her shy, or was it coy, upward glance, as the camera slid through her diaphanous skirt, which we saw earlier, or as more peculiarly, she gazed up adoringly at her royal beau. Now, it was peculiar because everyone knew he was shorter than she was. So she had to, either he had to stand in a box, or she had to kind of bend her knees somehow to look as though she was looking up. And I'm going to talk now about this looking up, looking down thing. The relation of power, and her tallness was something that she had to deal with in relation to his shortness. Okay. The relation of power to the gaze is analysed by Foucault in Surveiller et Punir, where he describes the people looking up to the monarch. This is quote 20. Traditionnellement, le pouvoir, c'est ce qui se voit, ce qui se montre, ce qui se manifeste. Jusque-là, le rôle de la cérémonie politique avait été de donner lieu à la manifestation à la fois excessive et réglée du pouvoir. So at these moments, royalty was on display, and the people were allowed to look, not on the face of power, as you cannot see the face of God and so on, and certainly not into its eyes, but at a proper distance and logically from below, hence the balcony. And of course the balcony appears also, you may know, in Genet, and I am on literature, Genet's Le Balcon, which was published in 1956, and it's very much about this idea. The balcony marks the visible liminal point between two worlds, the skin. The balcony and the television screen are both transmitting skins, two-sided in their function, again, of presenting and protecting. We gazed up, and by a certain distortion, we saw her gazing up too. By that distortion, and by the choreographed warriorism of the royal kiss, which you see on the screen, we understood certain things, that we were going to be, as B. Campbell put it with characteristic brutal sympathy, quote 21, able to watch her deflowering, and that what we got to see would never be the real thing. Power is vertical, firstly, as we have seen, because the few are on display to the many. And then, of course, Foucault goes on to explain that the individualization that follows from being gazed upon made a major shift in the late 18th century. Typically, in feudal regimes, of which the British monarchy is a late version writ small, ceremonies ensured that those with power and privilege became known to their public by an ascending individualization, which we've seen. Over the last 2 centuries, however, the downward gaze of a punitive surveillance of discipline individualizes the common man or woman. Quote 22, and on the screen, par des surveillances plutôt que par des cérémonies, par des mesures comparatives qui ont la norme pour référence, et non par des généalogies qui donnent les ancêtres pour point de repère, par des écarts plutôt que par des exploits. Individualized by the disciplining gaze as a basket case, what Diana said the Windsor family thought of her, or simply as a pretty woman, but also by the ceremonial positioning of her triumphal public role. Diana was herself a double-facing skin between the feudal and the modern modes of the exercise of power. In this sense, too, she stands for a circuit in which she was positioned at the middle point, absorbing and reflecting the two modes of gazing. And this was particularly her function for women. There was this feeling, I think, that we could adore but also pity her, because whatever we had been through, she had somehow been through it too. And so it allowed us to look simultaneously up and down as she was looking up and down. That idea of both longing to be looked at and dreading being looked upon were embodied in her. So she was, and this is from an editorial of the time, the unusually multifaceted reflector of a fragmented and fractious time. And it's interesting that actually in the years that have passed since she died, she's kind of disappeared from interest, quite curiously. To some extent she's been replaced by her daughter-in-law, but there is... Sorry, I'm going to stop on Diana. I'm going to go on to, can I do the Phantom Limb?
Yes,
okay.
5 minutes.
So Diana is one object in whom death allowed us to invest a complex of desires. But my argument in that piece of research that I was doing there was that we talk about mourning, and what we often describe mourning as though it is an ingestion or digestion process, and particularly that's the psychoanalytic attitude, that you eventually digest the trauma of your loss and you then go on to live again. And I'm actually more interested in the idea that it's a kind of skin we carry. Replacement children, one example. Anzieux was one, Rilke was one, Barry was one, Salvador Dali was famously one. Or it's a garment we wear, or some other kind of external prosthesis, imaginary friend, like Diana, or ghost, or phantom limb. So here is the phantom limb. Most people, this is quote 25, most people know what is meant, writes the neurologist V.S. Ramachandran, by a phantom limb. A patient has had an arm amputated because it has a malignant tumour or has been irreparably damaged in an accident, but continues to feel the presence of the amputated arm or leg or whatever. First named by Silas Weir Mitchell in 1872, it had already been recognised by Ambroise Paré in 1649. Famous example, of course, is, well, in British law, is Lord Nelson, who identified the twinges he felt in his lost arm as direct evidence for the existence of the soul. The feeling might be tingling, clenching, or twisting of fingers or toes, but the most common one is pain. The phantom limb is an externally projected part object, and as with a lost love object, it is hard to know what exactly is meant by saying, it hurts. The impersonal it in It's Raining or Il Pleut, etc., is said to refer to God or Jupiter. We always have this mixture of ownership and repudiation in relation to body parts that plague us, but in specific relation to the phantom limb, it's a bereaved relation. As Elizabeth Gross puts it, quote 27, the phantom is an expression of nostalgia for the unity and wholeness of the body, its completion. It's a memorial to the missing limb, a psychical delegate that stands in its place. And psychoanalytically, of course, there's a whole question of the supposedly, but of course not really, missing penis of women and how that might be mourned. Big issue, which I have a position on, but I won't talk about it now. There is an interesting phenomenon of cure by the same Ramachandran. It's the mirror box. You may know about this, or you may not, but I'm briefly going to show it to you. It's a box with a mirror in the middle. And if you say this hand is actually not there, and you have a phantom which is amputated but feels scrunched up like that, you put your good hand into one side, and it's then reflected on the other side as though you had two good hands. And if you wriggle the fingers on the good hand, the fingers on the phantom begin to uncurl. It's quite extraordinary, but apparently it does work, and it works for some time. And Ramachandran actually wrote that he felt he had achieved, quote 28, probably the first example in medical history of the successful amputation of a phantom limb. The phantom metaphor is actually very interesting because there are cases of people who have never had limbs at all, but who have phantoms. I'm going to ask you to do something very quickly. Fold your arms. Okay. Now fold your arms the other way. Now there's one way that feels completely right and normal and comfortable, and the other way doesn't. And this woman, this particular woman who had never had arms, she was born without arms, said her phantoms, it was the same with her phantoms. The one was fine and the other felt odd. Well, that's one strange phenomenon. There's also a case of something called supernumerary or anarchic limb. I went to a conference, so I know everything in the world. There was a woman who had 2 arms and 2 legs, but she was convinced she had a 3rd arm and 3rd leg each on the left side of her body. She had to give up her job in a fish sorting factory because she felt it was going to shoplift. Because she felt it was getting in the way, and she didn't go to supermarkets because she thought this extra arm might shoplift. Now this, I think, needs a perspective from the humanities, but there we are. Both of these imagined additions to the body makes the person actively more than they otherwise were. Even more thought-provoking, at this same conference, a professor called Chris Frith said, we all have phantom limbs, except that most of the time our real limbs coincide with them. Think about that. So, is our whole body a phantom limb? Are we all our own doppelganger? If we take Frith's remark and apply it to the lost object, what it suggests is that our real objects are as lost as the lost ones. And not only is all grief virtual, which is one of the things somebody said after Diana died, but all other emotions are too. There's also the case in Oliver Sacks, it appears twice, because it once happened to him, of somebody who thinks his leg no longer belongs, or just doesn't identify his leg as being part of his body, and thought some unkind friends had put it in his bed with him, threw the leg out, found himself on the floor. And I'm going to give you some examples of something similar. There are two other aberrant conditions which may shed some light on this, and that will bring us back to mourning, and in fact to literature in a second. There's a syndrome called Capgras syndrome, and it's somebody who has that is able to recognise a close relative or friend, the mother or the husband, as looking exactly like that person, but they fail to feel the normal response to them, and thus take them for an imposter. Ramachandran describes the case of a young man called Arthur, who after a car accident could no longer relate emotionally to his parents. He had no problems with them on the phone, but when he met them, he was convinced that they were imposters and not the real thing. Briefly, he was convinced by being told his false father had gone to China, but there was no return of the global ability to love them on sight. Ramachandran makes two connections that are of interest here. The first is in relation to, quote 31, the mechanics of how we form memories, in particular our ability to create enduring representations of faces. Arthur can't see that three photos of the same person, looking straight on, slightly to one side and a little further to one side, are the same face. Only when the model's eyes were looking way off to one side was he able to discern correctly that she wasn't looking at him. And Ramachandran argues, this is a bit like Memento. Have any of you seen Memento? Brilliant, brilliant film. That you may lose short-term memories of that way, and it relates to the retention of faces. And the second one is that Capgras syndrome can be connected to another syndrome called Cotard syndrome, in which, quote, a patient will assert that he is dead. Arthur says to his mother one day, if the real Arthur ever returns, do you promise that you will still treat me as a friend and love me? And now I'm going to quote a poem by Birkbeck about Orpheus and Eurydice. And I'll read it in German, but, sorry, that's Rilke. So two rather unusual images of him. And here's the poem. And this is the moment when, everything goes wrong as they're coming up out of the underworld. Und als plötzlich je, der Gott sie anhielt und mit Schmerz im Ausruf die Worte sprach, hat sich umgewendet, begriff sie nichts und sagte leise, wer? Fern aber, dunkel vor dem klaren Ausgang, stand irgendjemand, dessen Angesicht nicht zu erkennen war. So what's happening there is that as she turns around and she's told he has turned around, she says who? He ceases to be anybody. He becomes irgendjemand. So I'm ending on a rather sad note, actually. We can cheer up in the questions. I would suggest that this is the basic mechanism of the externalization of loss. It's actually an imagined encounter in which both parties are metamorphosed. After a betrayal, unlike a bereavement, we know the person who once loved us is still alive. We might even see them from time to time. But when, like Arthur or Eurydice, they fail to recognize us with love, when, that is, they manifest Capgras syndrome towards us, then perhaps we become their phantom limb.